The story of the Merovingians begins not in the grand halls of palaces, nor in the annals of celebrated kings, but in whispers of legend, in tales carried across rivers and forests by those who feared to forget. They were known as the long-haired kings, a dynasty that ruled over Gaul with a seeming touch of the divine, yet their very existence straddled the line between history and myth. Ancient chronicles speak of kings whose locks were not mere ornamentation, but sacred markers, strands of power said to be imbued with the blood of gods. Their lineage, some scholars claim, carried an essence that could not be replicated, a heritage that made them rulers not by conquest alone, but by some ineffable, mysterious right. Yet for all the grandeur and mystique, the true origins of the Merovingians remain shrouded. Some sources trace them to the semi-mythical figure of Merovec, a man said to be born of both mortal and otherworldly forces, a union that placed his descendants in the realm of the extraordinary. Legends suggest he emerged from a time when Europe was still a tangle of forests, rivers, and nascent kingdoms, a place where gods and men walked close enough that the boundary between them could be felt. The Merovingians, it is said, inherited this otherworldly connection. They ruled with a peculiar authority, not always measured by armies or wealth, but by an aura of power that could sway hearts and bend loyalty. And yet, the historical record is frustratingly sparse, fragmented across scattered annals and cryptic inscriptions, as though someone, perhaps history itself, wished to let them fade into shadow. This fading into shadow is not merely a matter of time's erosion. The Merovingians were, in many ways, inconvenient. Their sacred blood, their unbroken line, posed questions that were too dangerous for emerging powers to tolerate. The Carolingians, who would eventually supplant them, had reason to rewrite the story, casting the Merovingians as relics of a bygone age, kings whose power had decayed, whose legitimacy could be doubted. And so, the narrative we inherit is heavily filtered, a mixture of fact and fabrication, leaving tantalizing glimpses of a world long forgotten. Yet in those glimpses lies the seed of curiosity, the invitation to wonder what was lost when history turned its gaze elsewhere. But the intrigue of the Merovingians is not merely in their rise or fall. It is in the mystery of what came after, the silent journey that has been nearly erased from memory. If their presence in Gaul was eventually overshadowed, could it be that their story continued elsewhere, in lands forgotten by maps, in territories overlooked by chroniclers? Some whispers suggest that the dynasty did not vanish, but moved, carrying its secrets eastward, tracing paths that intersected with cultures, rivers, and mountains that rarely find mention in mainstream history. The notion of a hidden migration, of a lineage seeking refuge while preserving its sacred knowledge, opens a door into a shadowed chapter of the past, one that blends history with speculation, archaeology with legend. The Merovingians were not simply kings. They were custodians of a hidden heritage. The tales describe them as holders of ancient knowledge, keepers of traditions older than the empires that rose and fell around them. They are said to have preserved sacred symbols and rituals, codes written not only in texts, but in gestures, objects, and the very architecture of their domains. Their courts were not only political centers, but repositories of enigmatic wisdom, their movements deliberate, even secretive, designed to ensure that certain truths would survive, even if the dynastic line faced peril. And peril they did face, for the tides of conquest, betrayal, and political upheaval were relentless. Yet the idea that their knowledge and bloodline might have traveled beyond the known borders of Western Europe suggests a narrative far more expansive, one that reaches into the lands we rarely consider when studying the medieval world. Imagine, then, the forests of Gaul, dense and dark, through which Merovingian emissaries might have moved under the cover of night, their long hair catching the pale light of the moon as they sought refuge or forged secret alliances. Imagine the rivers and valleys that may have guided their journey, the ancient roads overgrown with time, yet once brimming with the passage of a royal lineage determined to survive. In this quiet, almost imperceptible movement, one begins to glimpse the possibility of a forgotten journey, one that challenges the neat borders of textbooks and invites the imagination to wander through uncharted territories of history. Every river bend, every hilltop, every abandoned ruin could hold a trace of their presence, a whisper that the story of the Merovingians did not end in defeat, but continued in shadows, hidden from view yet alive in fragments. As we embark on this exploration, we're not simply retracing steps, but listening to echoes of kings whose authority was more than temporal, whose lives were entwined with myth, prophecy, and sacred knowledge. To follow their path is to embrace uncertainty, to acknowledge that history is not always linear, and that some truths are deliberately obscured, waiting for the curious to piece them together. It is here, at the intersection of legend and reality, that we begin our journey eastward, tracing the forgotten lands of a dynasty that once held a throne, yet may have found a new kingdom far beyond the eyes of the chroniclers who sought to erase them. In the quiet spaces between recorded events, between the strokes of ink on fragile parchment, and in the remnants of structures long abandoned, there lies the possibility of discovery. The Merovingians, with their sacred hair and whispered power, invite us to look beyond the obvious, to question what has been written, and to imagine a world where their influence stretched far beyond what we think we know. This is not merely a story of kings and conquest. It is a story of survival, of secret knowledge, and of a journey into lands almost entirely forgotten, yet holding the potential to rewrite the way we understand an age that shaped the foundations of Europe. The path ahead is uncertain, shadowed, and enigmatic, but it is precisely this uncertainty that makes the journey compelling. Every step we take into the eastern journey of the Merovingians brings us closer to understanding not just the fate of a dynasty, but the nature of history itself, a history that hides as much as it reveals, whispering secrets only to those willing to listen. The Merovingians exist in that peculiar space where history and legend entwine so tightly that it becomes impossible to separate them. To the chroniclers of their own time, they were kings, rulers with dominion over the lands of Gaul, wielding armies and administering justice. Yet to storytellers and bards, they were something more, a lineage touched by the divine, their deeds and misdeeds echoing with the resonance of myth. It is in this tension between recorded fact and whispered tale that the true fascination with the Merovingians begins. They were kings whose very existence seemed to challenge the boundaries of reality, figures whose lives were catalogued with reverence, fear, and sometimes outright fabrication. The earliest written accounts often blur the line between reality and fable. One chronicler might describe Clovis, the great unifier, with precise battles and alliances, while another insists that his power derived from a sacred anointment, a mystical bloodline that guaranteed his rule. Stories of miraculous births, kings who seemed to possess knowledge beyond their years, and rulers whose long hair was not merely symbolic but an emblem of sacred energy, are scattered through medieval texts. Some claim these legends were designed to impress, to awe the populace into obedience, while others suggest they are fragments of a deeper truth, deliberately coded in narrative form, meant to be recognized only by those initiated into the secrets of the dynasty. It is here, in the gaps, silences, and contradictions, that the Merovingians' eastern journey begins to take shape. Mainstream history, with its preference for concrete records, often dismisses these tales as fanciful exaggerations, yet the persistence of such myths across centuries suggests something more. Oral traditions, particularly in regions bordering the empire, recount stories of long-haired kings who left their lands under threat, traveling into unfamiliar territories. These accounts, vague and inconsistent though they may be, hint at migrations not recorded by official chroniclers, movements that were erased, ignored, or deliberately forgotten by historians seeking neat narratives of conquest and succession. The idea that legends can contain hidden truths is not new. Every era has possessed its own set of myths, many of which, when examined through the lens of archaeology or comparative history, reveal surprising accuracy. In the case of the Merovingians, legends of sacred relics, hidden treasures, and secret knowledge may very well encode practical information, routes of escape, safe havens, and distant settlements. These stories could have been preserved in a form deliberately obscure, to shield the dynasty's secrets from outsiders while leaving breadcrumbs for those who could decipher them. In this sense, myth is not merely fanciful storytelling, but a map, a guide through the shadows of history. The tension between legend and recorded history is further complicated by the deliberate suppression of Merovingian memory. As the Carolingians rose to power, the narrative of sacred kingship, long hair, and mystical bloodlines became inconvenient. Histories written under Carolingian influence painted Merovingians as decadent, weak, and irrelevant, a contrast designed to legitimize the new dynasty. This suppression created fertile ground for mystery, a vacuum in which legends could thrive. By denying the Merovingians their rightful place in recorded history, successive powers ensured that only fragments would survive, scattered across chronicles, folklore, and cryptic inscriptions, waiting for the curious to discover them centuries later. These surviving fragments often defy conventional interpretation. One may find a chronicle describing a Merovingian king disappearing into the forests of the East, another mentioning a sacred relic carried far beyond Gaul, and yet another recording a mysterious alliance with distant peoples whose lands are untraceable on contemporary maps. Each piece is tantalizing yet incomplete, forcing the modern researcher, or the viewer of this story, to read between the lines, to imagine connections, to consider that the mainstream narrative may be only a partial truth. In this tension, the Merovingians remain eternally compelling, a dynasty whose reality cannot be neatly separated from legend, whose story demands both imagination and careful scrutiny. The legends also hint at a level of sophistication and strategy that modern historians often overlook. If one accepts that the Merovingians may have been forced to flee or disperse eastward, the myths surrounding their sacred blood and mystical knowledge take on new significance. These were not idle stories. They may have been deliberate tools, designed to protect the dynasty and its secrets, to intimidate enemies, and to encode guidance for descendants. The tales of miraculous births, prophetic visions, or otherworldly guidance could serve as a psychological shield, preserving identity and purpose in the midst of upheaval. In this light, myth becomes a living instrument of survival, as much a part of the dynasty's strategy as any army or fortress. Furthermore, the persistence of these stories across centuries suggests a collective memory that defies erasure. Even when official records were rewritten, when monasteries and courts sought to diminish the Merovingians' influence, the legends survived in obscure manuscripts, regional folklore, and the subtle echoes of language and ritual. In eastern lands, far from the power centers of Gaul, oral traditions may have retained the memory of these kings more faithfully than the formal chronicles, preserving knowledge of their journeys, alliances, and sacred practices. It is here, in the tension between absence and presence, between historical silence and mythic persistence, that the eastern journey of the Merovingians begins to emerge, shadowy but undeniable. To follow these threads is to enter a world where the boundaries of history are deliberately porous, where the line between fact and fiction is not merely blurred but intentionally constructed. The Merovingians challenge us to reconsider what we accept as truth, to acknowledge the power of stories, and to explore the possibility that the unknown is not merely a void, but a space filled with traces, hints, and echoes of lives that once moved across the lands we think we know. In tracing the legends eastward, we are not merely recounting old tales. We are engaging with a hidden map of survival, migration, and preservation, a story encoded in myth and whispered across centuries. The allure of the Merovingians lies not only in their deeds, but in the way their memory defies erasure. Every contradiction, every fantastical claim, is an invitation to look deeper, to question the narrative imposed by victors, and to consider that history may be hiding as much as it reveals. And so, as we move from legend to evidence, from myth to the faint traces left in Eastern Europe and beyond, we begin to understand that the Merovingian story is far from complete. Their journey eastward, whispered in chronicles, folklore, and cryptic relics, is a story of survival, secrecy, and endurance. A story that continues to unfold if we are willing to follow its hidden path. The decline of the Merovingians in Western Europe was neither sudden nor simple. It was a slow unraveling, a gradual erosion of power that unfolded over generations, shaped as much by internal divisions as by external pressures. The dynasty that had once ruled Gaul with seeming divine authority began to falter as rival factions, both within and beyond their borders, seized opportunity from their weaknesses. Kings were divided, authority fragmented, and the aura of sacred invincibility, once so palpable in their long-haired rulers, began to waver. Where there had once been certainty, there emerged instability, and with it, the seeds of a migration whose traces would later be hidden in shadow. The rise of the Carolingians marked a decisive turning point. Once allies or vassals, they slowly assumed the mantle of power, their ascent often justified through narratives that depicted the Merovingians as decadent and ineffectual. Political maneuvering, strategic marriages, and decisive battles all played their part in this quiet but unstoppable replacement of one dynasty with another. Yet behind the official accounts of conquest and legitimacy lies a deeper, subtler story. The Merovingians were not merely overthrown. Some were forced into exile, driven into lands where their presence would be less visible, where they could preserve themselves and, perhaps, their sacred heritage. As their political structures crumbled, whispers of secret departures began to circulate. Chroniclers, often aligned with new rulers, rarely recorded these movements openly, but hints exist in obscure annals, scattered notes, and the cryptic writings of monastic scribes. Some accounts speak of kings vanishing under mysterious circumstances, of nobles traveling eastward along hidden paths, or of sacred relics and treasures carried away under the cloak of night. These faint traces suggest a deliberate exodus, a carefully orchestrated retreat aimed at survival rather than conquest, a journey that mainstream history would prefer to forget. The decline in authority did not mean a total loss of influence. Even as the Merovingians' visible power waned, their spiritual and symbolic significance remained potent. They were still considered sacred, their bloodline a mark of legitimacy and divine favor. In a Europe increasingly shaped by warfare, conquest, and religious dogma, this aura could provide protection, allowing them to negotiate, hide, or travel in ways inaccessible to ordinary nobles. It is within this tension between fading political might and enduring sacred authority that the idea of an eastward journey begins to take shape. A migration that was as much about preserving identity and knowledge as it was about evading the forces that sought to erase them. One can imagine the challenges faced during this period. The shifting alliances, the ever-present threat of betrayal, and the logistical demands of moving people, families, and treasures across vast, unfamiliar territories. Forests, rivers, and mountains became both refuge and barrier, guiding or impeding movement as necessary. Travel would have been perilous, requiring intimate knowledge of the land, trusted networks, and perhaps even secret guides who knew the hidden routes. In this context, the Merovingians' legendary awareness, their purported connection to the sacred and prophetic, could have been more than myth. It could have been a practical advantage, helping them navigate not just the physical landscape, but the complex web of politics, culture, and danger that defined early medieval Europe. The question of why they might have turned eastward is multifaceted. The eastern regions offered not only distance from the rising power of the Carolingians, but also opportunities for alliances, trade, and refuge among peoples less influenced by Western politics. These lands, though often overlooked in historical narratives, were far from empty. They were vibrant, dynamic, and culturally diverse. To move east was to enter territories where the Merovingians' presence could remain undetected, yet still exert subtle influence. The journey was not a simple flight, but a strategic relocation, guided by knowledge, foresight, and perhaps the remnants of sacred wisdom preserved over generations. In tandem with physical movement, the dynasty likely took steps to safeguard its cultural and spiritual legacy. Sacred relics, cryptic manuscripts, and symbols of authority may have been transported as portable markers of identity, ensuring that even in exile, the essence of Merovingian power endured. This was a dynasty acutely aware of its fragility in the face of shifting political tides, yet determined to survive. Their retreat was as much about preservation as it was about evasion, a deliberate strategy to endure beyond the reach of those who sought to erase their legacy. The collapse of Merovingian power in the West also reveals a broader truth about history itself, that the official record often reflects the triumphs of those who write it, rather than the full spectrum of human movement and ambition. What survives are chronicles favoring the victors, while the movements of the displaced, the secret journeys, and the hidden continuities are largely invisible. Yet these very silences are clues, hinting at paths once traveled and secrets carefully guarded. The narrative of decline, of kings fading from sight, is therefore not the end of the story but the beginning of a journey. A hidden journey that invites us to look beyond the surface of recorded events and imagine the paths they may have taken. As we explore the possibility of Eastern migration, it becomes clear that the Merovingian story did not simply vanish with the fall of their political power. Rather, it transformed, moving into shadow, into territory less documented but no less significant. It is a story of survival, of adaptation, and of determination to preserve a lineage that carried more than mere names or titles. It carried sacred heritage, secrets, and perhaps knowledge too dangerous or valuable to be left behind. Their journey eastward, hinted at in fragments of chronicle, in fleeting references to vanished nobles and hidden treasures, opens a new chapter in the history of Europe, one largely ignored, yet rich with possibility and intrigue. The collapse of the Western Merovingian power thus sets the stage for discovery. It is a story of a dynasty forced to confront not just enemies in battle, but the very forces of history that sought to erase them. And in this confrontation, in their retreat and strategic migration, lies the path eastward, a journey that promises mystery, survival, and the preservation of secrets that may still linger in forgotten lands. As we follow these traces, we begin to glimpse a world in which history, myth, and secrecy intertwine, revealing a legacy that refuses to be forgotten and an Eastern journey waiting to be uncovered. Maps, as we understand them today, are more than mere representations of geography. They're instruments of power, tools to assert dominion, and in some cases, vessels of secrecy. The Merovingians, as they faced the decline of their influence in Western Europe, would have been acutely aware of the importance of knowledge of terrain, of the hidden paths that could guide them beyond the reach of enemies. Yet much of what they may have relied upon, maps, manuscripts, even oral guides, has been lost, obscured, or intentionally destroyed. What remains are fragments, distorted by time, suggesting routes and lands almost entirely forgotten by modern historians. These are the maps lost to time, whispering hints of a journey eastward, a migration that history preferred not to record. In the surviving maps from the early medieval period, one observes curious anomalies. Some regions are depicted with unusual detail, while others, closer to the known centers of power, are strangely vague. Rivers twist in unexpected ways. Mountains appear exaggerated or misplaced, and territories are annotated with symbols whose meaning has been obscured by centuries. Scholars have debated these irregularities for generations, some dismissing them as errors, others seeing in them the fingerprints of deliberate concealment. Could it be that certain maps were designed not to reveal, but to hide? That they contained coded directions, known only to those initiated into the secrets of a dynasty seeking to escape the grasp of rising powers? In these subtle distortions, the faint outline of the Merovingians' eastern journey begins to emerge. The possibility of hidden routes is reinforced by contemporary chronicles and travel accounts. Monastic scribes, for instance, occasionally recorded strange roads or rivers used by unknown travelers, paths that skirted the major centers of power and connected distant, sparsely populated regions. In some cases, these routes intersected with areas later associated with Merovingian settlements or influence, hinting at the preservation of knowledge across generations. The eastern lands, stretching from the forests of modern-day Germany to the plains of Eastern Europe and the reaches of the Black Sea, offered both refuge and opportunity. Their remoteness, coupled with relative political instability, provided a landscape where a displaced dynasty could conceal itself while maintaining control over its sacred heritage. One can imagine the care with which these maps were created and used. They were not merely practical tools for navigation, but instruments of memory and strategy. Each river, forest, and mountain pass could be a deliberate choice, guiding travelers along paths that were both safe and symbolically significant. These routes may have been marked with natural indicators, with small shrines, cairns, or carvings in trees, all encoded with meanings only the initiated could interpret. To those outside the circle, the maps would appear incomplete or inaccurate. Yet to the Merovingians and their trusted retainers, they were detailed guides, a roadmap to survival in lands where both danger and sanctuary awaited. The concept of lost or hidden maps is further complicated by the political realities of the time. As the Carolingians consolidated power in the West, any record of Merovingian escape routes, settlements, or alliances would have been considered a threat. Manuscripts, maps, and guides may have been destroyed, altered, or buried, leaving behind only hints and fragments. What survives today, maps scattered across monastic libraries, marginalia and chronicles, and occasionally hidden in palimpsests, offers tantalizing glimpses of a journey intentionally obscured. It is as if the very geography of Europe bears the imprint of a story that was deliberately erased, a journey meant to be forgotten, yet impossible to hide entirely. The lost maps also reveal a broader understanding of the Merovingians' intelligence and foresight. They were a dynasty that understood the value of secrecy and subtlety, that could plan for survival beyond the immediate threats of war and conquest. Knowledge of hidden paths, distant rivers, and unmarked forests was more than strategic, it was spiritual. The dynasty's sacred heritage, entwined with myths of divine blood and mystical foresight, may have guided their selection of routes, ensuring that every movement was in harmony with both practical safety and symbolic meaning. In this sense, the maps were not just geographical tools, but expressions of an esoteric worldview, merging survival with sacred purpose. Exploring these maps today is like reading a layered text, one in which geography, history, and hidden narrative converge. A forest may represent not only a physical obstacle, but a symbolic boundary. A river may serve as both a navigational aid and a marker of lineage or ritual. The eastern regions, in particular, appear repeatedly as spaces of both concealment and continuity, suggesting that the Merovingians' journey was deliberate, purposeful, and extensive. Villages, ruins, and relics discovered centuries later align, in some cases, with these lost routes, offering further evidence that the maps were not merely speculative, but rooted in the movement of real people and treasures. These hidden paths also invite speculation about the interactions the Merovingians may have had along the way. Traveling through unknown territories required alliances with local leaders, negotiation with tribes, and a delicate balance of power and secrecy. The routes suggested by surviving maps may hint at these encounters, the subtle diplomacy and strategic placements necessary for survival. Every fork in a road, every river crossing, and every mountain pass may have represented not just a physical challenge, but an opportunity to maintain influence, secure resources, and continue the preservation of a lineage that was both mortal and sacred. In contemplating the lost maps, one begins to realize that the eastern journey of the Merovingians was more than a flight from political defeat. It was an orchestrated migration, guided by knowledge, intuition, and an awareness of a landscape that extended beyond what conventional maps could convey. The terrain itself becomes a character in the story, shaping and recording the path of a dynasty determined to endure. Rivers, forests, and plains become repositories of memory, subtle markers of a journey that history has tried to conceal but cannot entirely erase. As we attempt to reconstruct these routes today, using the fragments of maps, chronicles, and archaeological hints, we enter a landscape where mystery and history intertwine. Every overlooked village, every abandoned road, and every hidden monastery may hold a trace of the Merovingians' presence. The journey eastward, guided by maps lost to time, emerges as both a literal and symbolic expedition, a movement through lands that challenge perception, test endurance, and preserve the secrets of a dynasty that refused to be forgotten. It is here, in these forgotten corridors of Europe, that the story of the Merovingians extends beyond the known, inviting us to follow a path that is as enigmatic as it is compelling. Even as the Merovingians faced the collapse of their power in the West, whispers persisted of those who remained loyal to the bloodline, individuals and groups whose purpose was not political dominance, but the preservation of sacred knowledge. These were the guardians of the line, a network of secretive custodians who acted in shadows, unseen by kings and historians alike. Their mission was perilous, to safeguard relics, manuscripts, and the very essence of a dynasty whose survival was threatened not only by conquest, but by deliberate erasure. In these clandestine circles, the Merovingians were not merely exiled rulers. They were living symbols of a sacred heritage that demanded protection at all costs. The existence of such guardians is hinted at in scattered medieval texts and obscure chronicles. References to monks, abbots, and secretive nobles who possessed esoteric knowledge appear sporadically, often coded in language that only the initiated could interpret. Some are described as keepers of relics, entrusted with sacred vessels, scrolls, or objects imbued with symbolic power. Others are noted as guides for exiled princes, ensuring that the bloodline remained intact even as the dynasty's political influence waned. These individuals were the invisible threads connecting past and future, bridging the gap between a visible, declining monarchy and a hidden legacy that could survive centuries. The methods by which the guardians operated were as sophisticated as they were secretive. Manuscripts were written in cipher, symbols etched into stone, and messages conveyed through ritualistic gestures or coded language. These signs were meant to be read only by those within the inner circle, a protective measure against both opportunistic rulers and the general populace, who might misinterpret or exploit the knowledge. In some cases, entire monastic communities may have functioned as custodial enclaves, deliberately isolated from mainstream religious or political oversight, preserving not only the texts and relics, but also the ceremonial practices that encoded the Merovingian identity. The guardians were not merely passive protectors. They were active participants in shaping the survival of the dynasty. They selected routes for migration, determined safe havens, and advised on alliances with local rulers or tribes. In this way, the eastern journey of the Merovingians was not a chaotic flight, but a carefully orchestrated strategy, guided by individuals who understood both the value of secrecy and the necessity of foresight. The guardians ensured that sacred objects, knowledge, and even rituals were transported intact, preserving the lineage's spiritual and cultural heritage for future generations. Their work was both pragmatic and symbolic, merging survival with the continuity of a sacred tradition. The artifacts and relics entrusted to these custodians are particularly revealing. Coins, ceremonial objects, and manuscripts often bear subtle symbols, long hair, celestial patterns, and obscure inscriptions that reflect the Merovingians' sacred identity. Some items are tied to ritual practices that remain mysterious to this day, hinting at knowledge that blends spirituality, political authority, and perhaps even prophetic insight. The careful movement of these objects along hidden routes further emphasizes the importance placed on their protection. They were not mere trinkets, but vessels of memory, holding the story of a dynasty that the world was determined to forget. Oral tradition also played a crucial role in the Guardians' work. Stories, chants, and cryptic songs passed from one generation to the next served as living repositories of history and instruction. In lands east of Gaul, where written records were scarce, these oral traditions may have been the only means of preserving the Merovingians' heritage. Every tale carried a layer of meaning. Every chant encoded guidance for those who would continue the journey. Through this careful transmission of knowledge, the custodians ensured that even in exile, the identity and purpose of the dynasty remained alive, embedded in the minds of those who were entrusted with its secrets. It is in these guardians that we see the intersection of myth and strategy, of secrecy and survival. The Merovingians' sacred identity was not merely ceremonial, it was operational. Knowledge of the bloodline's power, the significance of their relics, and the routes for migration were all intertwined, forming a network of protection that extended across geography and time. These custodians were the invisible architects of continuity, ensuring that the dynasty's essence could withstand political upheaval, cultural erasure, and the relentless march of history. They were, in essence, the silent heartbeat of the Merovingian legacy, beating steadily even as the world sought to forget. The concept of guardians also hints at a larger spiritual dimension. In many accounts, the Merovingian sacred blood was not simply a symbol of rulership, but a conduit of divine or mystical power. Protecting this lineage was therefore both a worldly and spiritual task. The custodians' efforts ensured that the dynasty's unique heritage remained intact, allowing the possibility that the Merovingians could one day reassert influence, not necessarily through armies, but through the enduring authority of knowledge, tradition, and sacred identity. The Guardians' vigilance transformed exile into a purposeful journey, one in which every movement, every choice of refuge, and every secret preserved became part of a larger, almost mystical strategy. As we trace the eastern journey of the Merovingians, the presence of these guardians becomes increasingly vital. Without them, relics might have been lost, manuscripts destroyed, and sacred practices forgotten. With them, a hidden continuity persisted, a thread connecting the lost lands of Gaul to distant regions far to the east. They are the quiet architects behind the dynasty's survival, the silent witnesses ensuring that even as history turned its back, the Merovingians' legacy remained alive. It is through understanding their role that we begin to see the Eastern journey not as a mere escape, but as a deliberate, intelligent, and sacred undertaking, a migration guided by foresight, devotion, and a determination to preserve a legacy that refused to fade. In the end, the guardians of the sacred line reveal the depth of the Merovingians' resilience. Their work demonstrates that history is rarely simple, and that the survival of a dynasty may depend not only on armies and fortresses, but on knowledge, secrecy, and unwavering devotion to a lineage. The Eastern journey, facilitated and protected by these hidden custodians, becomes not only a tale of migration, but a story of persistence, strategy, and sacred purpose. It is a story that invites us to look beyond the visible, to consider the forces that move quietly in the shadows, and to recognize that the survival of the Merovingians was as much the work of unseen guardians as it was the deeds of kings themselves. As the Merovingians moved eastward, their journey was not aimless. Every step, every settlement, every hidden refuge was chosen with purpose, guided by knowledge preserved by guardians and by the dynastic instinct to survive. In these lands, far removed from the power centers of Western Europe, they sought strongholds, places that offered both concealment and the potential to maintain influence. These were not mere villages or temporary camps, but locations carefully selected for strategic, spiritual, and symbolic significance. Here, in the forests, hills, and river valleys of Eastern Europe, the Merovingians left traces of their presence that are faint but discernible to those who know where and how to look. The strongholds themselves were remarkable in both design and placement. They were often built upon natural defenses, hills that commanded sweeping views of surrounding lands, rivers that serve as moats and arteries of communication, and dense forests that concealed their approach. Some were simple, almost rustic fortifications, while others reveal an unexpected sophistication, incorporating knowledge of architecture and geometry that seems advanced for the time. Archaeologists who stumble upon ruins in these regions often find layouts that suggest ceremonial significance, with central courtyards, altars, and structures oriented to celestial patterns. Such precision hints at a society that combined practicality with ritual, blending security with sacred symbolism. These settlements were also places of community, designed to sustain the exiled dynasty and its followers. Homes, workshops, and meeting spaces were clustered in ways that facilitated both protection and cohesion. They allowed for the continuation of cultural practices, the education of younger generations in sacred rituals, and the preservation of knowledge deemed too dangerous or valuable to entrust to the outside world. The strongholds became microcosms of Merovingian society, miniature versions of the courts and palaces left behind, yet adapted to the realities of exile. Here, political authority and spiritual stewardship merged, sustaining the dynasty far from its original territories. Artifacts found in these regions hint at the presence of a highly organized network. Coins minted in unusual locations, ceremonial items, and symbols carved into stones would all suggest continuity with Merovingian traditions. These objects carry subtle markers, long-haired figures, celestial motifs, and cryptic inscriptions that resonate with the sacred identity of the dynasty. The strongholds were thus more than mere refuges. They were repositories of history and culture, places where the Merovingians' sacred knowledge could survive intact, shielded from the forces that sought to erase them. The strategic placement of these eastern strongholds also suggests a nuanced understanding of geography and politics. They were located along rivers that facilitated trade, communication, and movement, yet far enough from major centers of power to remain hidden. Some were near the borders of different tribal regions, allowing the Merovingians to forge alliances or seek protection from sympathetic local rulers. Others were situated in regions with difficult terrain, dense forests, rugged hills, or marshlands that would deter invaders while providing the dynasty with natural concealment. Every location reflects careful calculation, a deep awareness of both the physical and human landscape. The strongholds were not isolated. They were connected by hidden paths, rivers, and forests, forming a network that allowed communication, movement, and the transfer of knowledge. This network enabled the Merovingians to maintain a semblance of centralized authority even in exile. It also facilitated the movement of sacred relics, documents, and treasures, ensuring that the spiritual and cultural continuity of the dynasty could be preserved. In some cases, monasteries or small religious communities may have functioned as outposts, extending influence, preserving manuscripts, and reinforcing the sacred identity of the line in lands far from the old Gaulish heartland. What is particularly fascinating about these strongholds is the blending of practicality with esoteric symbolism. Many show evidence of sacred architecture, alignments with solstices, ritual spaces within fortifications, and the use of numerology in layouts. The Merovingians were not merely seeking safety. They were consciously embedding their beliefs, rituals, and sacred heritage into the very fabric of their settlements. Every stone, every structure, every placement held meaning beyond the practical, a message to those who would come after, or a safeguard for knowledge meant to survive centuries in secrecy. The legacy of these strongholds is subtle but persistent. Even centuries later, remnants of their presence can be traced in folklore, local customs, and unusual architectural features that do not conform to regional norms. Some villages retain names with obscure origins, while others contain ruins that hint at once grand structures. Hidden manuscripts discovered in monasteries far from Western centers often reference distant lands, unexplained lineages, or sacred objects transported from the West. Together, these fragments suggest that the Merovingians' eastern settlements were not ephemeral refuges, but enduring centers of culture, religion, and authority. In addition to physical structures, these strongholds functioned as incubators for the preservation and transmission of sacred knowledge. Young members of the dynasty and trusted followers were educated in rituals, language, and symbols that encoded the family's identity. Oral tradition, ceremony, and mentorship ensured that the essence of Merovingian authority could survive beyond immediate danger. The strongholds were living institutions, carefully designed to cultivate continuity across generations, blending secrecy, education, and cultural resilience. Through them, the dynasty could survive in exile without losing the sacred elements that defined it. The eastern strongholds also suggest that the Merovingians' influence extended far beyond the confines of their immediate settlements. They may have interacted with local rulers, formed strategic alliances, and subtly shaped political, cultural, and religious landscapes. Even in exile, the dynasty was not passive. It actively preserved its heritage while adapting to new environments. This duality of concealment and influence, secrecy and subtle governance, defines the Eastern journey. The strongholds were at once safe havens and hubs of continuity, silent witnesses to a story that would otherwise have been lost to history. Ultimately, the Eastern strongholds reveal the Merovingians' remarkable resilience. They demonstrate a dynasty that, stripped of visible power, relied on intelligence, sacred knowledge, and strategic planning to survive. These hidden settlements are tangible proof of a journey that stretched beyond Gaul, a testament to the enduring nature of a lineage that refused to vanish entirely. Through careful selection of locations, the integration of sacred symbolism, and the establishment of protective networks, the Merovingians transformed exile into opportunity, leaving a traceable yet mysterious footprint across forgotten lands. It is in these strongholds that we see the dynasty's spirit preserved, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to read the landscape of history with eyes attuned to secrets. Among the most compelling traces of the Merovingians in their eastern journey are the artifacts they left behind. These objects, often unassuming at first glance, carry layers of meaning that bridge the gap between history and legend, speaking in a language of symbols, rituals, and sacred identity. Coins, jewelry, manuscripts, ceremonial objects, and even fragments of architecture serve as whispers of a dynasty that deliberately preserved its presence, leaving messages only those attuned to their significance could interpret. In studying these artifacts, one begins to see the Eastern migration not as a vague legend, but as a tangible movement encoded into objects that endure across centuries. Coins minted in hidden settlements are particularly revealing. Unlike standard coinage produced for commerce, many of these pieces bear unusual markings, stylized long-haired figures, celestial motifs, or cryptic inscriptions that echo Merovingian iconography. Their production suggests that the dynasty sought not merely to circulate currency, but to signal identity, maintain authority, and leave a mark of continuity in lands far removed from Gaul. Each coin is a statement. We are here, our heritage survives, and our line remains sacred. The distribution of these coins along certain trade routes hints at strategic placement, reinforcing both survival and influence. Manuscripts and scrolls found in monasteries and hidden archives across Eastern Europe add another dimension to the story. These texts, often written in cipher or employing cryptic symbols, preserve ritual instructions, genealogical records, and even prophecies associated with the Merovingians. They speak of sacred bloodlines, hidden treasures, and journeys undertaken by those seeking refuge from the West. The texts are fragmentary, sometimes faded or overwritten, yet they contain echoes of a sophisticated system of knowledge preservation. Each manuscript was more than a record. It was a tool of memory, a vessel carrying sacred authority into unfamiliar lands, ensuring that even in exile, the dynasty's identity could survive intact. Ceremonial objects discovered in forgotten settlements further reinforce this sense of sacred continuity. Cups, bowls, amulets, and ritualistic instruments, often crafted with extraordinary precision, bear symbols and designs that align with known Merovingian motifs. Some are linked to solar or celestial patterns, suggesting that rituals and spiritual practices were carefully maintained in Eastern strongholds. The objects were not only symbolic, but functional, used in ceremonies designed to reaffirm the dynasty's sacred mandate and to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. Through these relics, the Merovingians' mystical heritage persisted in exile, encoded in material form and ready to be interpreted by those initiated into their secrets. Architectural remnants also serve as a form of artifact, embedding the Merovingians' presence into the landscape itself. Certain ruins reveal layouts and orientations that suggest ceremonial or symbolic intent, aligning with solstices, cardinal directions, or astronomical phenomena. Even seemingly ordinary structures, walls, gates, and courtyards, may contain hidden markers or inscriptions that connect them to the dynasty's sacred identity. These constructions indicate not only practical planning for defense and habitation, but also a deliberate integration of heritage, ritual, and symbolism, ensuring that even in exile, the Merovingians left an indelible imprint on the lands they inhabited. Many of these artifacts bear witness to the dynasty's adaptability. They were created to function in unfamiliar contexts, to communicate identity and authority without attracting undue attention, and to survive the passage of time. Their subtlety reflects a sophisticated understanding of secrecy and perception. A carefully inscribed coin could circulate without arousing suspicion. A manuscript could be hidden among innocuous texts. A ceremonial object could serve as both tool and message. The Merovingians' attention to detail demonstrates a remarkable strategic vision, intertwining survival, sacred practice, and influence in ways that extend beyond the purely physical realm. Some artifacts also suggest the dynasty's interactions with local cultures and peoples along the eastern route. Designs and motifs occasionally incorporate regional elements, blending Merovingian identity with local traditions. This synthesis may have served multiple purposes. It could disguise the artifact's origins, facilitate integration into new communities, and signal subtle alliances with local rulers or elites. In this way, the material culture of the Merovingians was not static. It evolved, adapted, and communicated across cultural boundaries, preserving the dynasty's sacred core while responding to the practical demands of exile. Archaeological evidence, when viewed collectively, paints a picture of a deliberate and sustained Eastern presence. From hidden coins in river valleys to manuscripts in monastic libraries, from ceremonial objects in forested settlements to architectural traces in hills and plains, the artifacts form a network of clues pointing to both movement and continuity. They speak not only of survival, but of intention, revealing a dynasty determined to maintain its sacred identity even in lands far removed from its heartland. Each artifact is a message to the future. The Merovingians endured, their knowledge persisted, and their journey eastward left a tangible mark on the world. The study of these artifacts also illuminates the interplay between secrecy and legacy. The Merovingians understood that survival required more than mere flight. It required the preservation of symbols, rituals, and knowledge that could guide their descendants and allies. Every object, every manuscript, every carefully designed structure was part of a system that encoded the dynasty's identity and purpose. These artifacts are, in effect, a hidden language, a materialized memory that has endured despite deliberate efforts to erase it from mainstream history. They invite scholars, explorers, and enthusiasts alike to read between the lines, to interpret the whispers of a lineage that refused to vanish. In essence, the artifacts of the Merovingians transformed the Eastern journey from speculation into a narrative grounded in tangible evidence. They reveal a dynasty that was both human and sacred, strategic and mystical, exiled yet enduring. Through coins, manuscripts, ceremonial objects, and architectural traces, we begin to see a coherent story. The journey eastward was not merely a flight from power, but a carefully orchestrated migration that preserved identity, authority, and sacred knowledge. The Merovingians' artifacts whisper across time, urging us to listen closely and consider the paths they forged, the strongholds they built, and the legacy they carried into lands almost forgotten by history. As we move deeper into the enigma of the Merovingians' eastern journey, the evidence begins to emerge in fragments, tantalizing, elusive, and scattered across texts, artifacts, and local traditions. Piecing together this evidence requires not only careful historical analysis, but also a willingness to interpret subtle clues embedded in the cultural, political, and spiritual landscapes of the regions they traversed. Though conventional histories often overlook or dismiss these traces, the evidence suggests a deliberate and far-reaching expedition, one that left an indelible imprint on the territories it touched, even if that imprint is hidden beneath layers of secrecy and time. Manuscripts, often overlooked in conventional scholarship, provide the first hints of the Eastern expedition. Obscure chronicles from Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia contain references to pale kings, foreign emissaries, and mysterious gifts arriving from the West. While these accounts are often fragmentary and cryptically worded, when considered collectively, they suggest contact with a sophisticated and secretive delegation, likely Merovingian in origin. Some texts describe ceremonial interactions, the exchange of gifts, or the transmission of esoteric knowledge, though the terminology is deliberately obscure, perhaps to prevent casual readers from understanding the full significance. Maps, too, hold subtle but compelling evidence. Certain medieval cartographic works contain anomalies, blank spaces, unusual markers, or routes that do not correspond to known trade or political pathways. These discrepancies, when cross-referenced with textual sources, suggest the existence of deliberately hidden routes taken by emissaries traveling eastward. Some scholars propose that the maps were designed not for general use, but as coded guides for initiates or trusted allies. Lines that seem irregular or symbols that appear out of place may have served as directional cues, referencing safe passages, spiritual sites, or hidden caches along the journey. Artifacts provide another layer of evidence. Jewelry, ceremonial objects, and religious relics unearthed in regions along the proposed route bear iconography and stylistic features reminiscent of Western European craftsmanship of the Merovingian era. Some of these artifacts are inexplicably located far from known centers of Merovingian influence, suggesting they were transported deliberately rather than through trade or conquest. In some cases, inscriptions or symbols on these objects point to connections with sacred bloodlines or esoteric traditions, reinforcing the notion that they were not mere items of value, but carried deeper symbolic or practical meaning. Linguistic traces further support the notion of an Eastern expedition. Certain place names, loanwords, and local terminologies reflect Western European influence during the early medieval period, indicating interactions between Merovingian emissaries and Eastern communities. While these linguistic markers are subtle, they are significant. They suggest a level of cultural exchange and communication that would be difficult to explain through ordinary trade or incidental contact. These linguistic echoes hint at a deliberate, sustained presence and imply that the emissaries were able to navigate complex social and political landscapes while leaving minimal overt trace. Oral traditions and folklore are equally revealing, though they often require careful interpretation. Across Eastern Europe and Central Asia, stories of pale or mysterious kings, emissaries bearing sacred relics, and secretive travelers align with known Merovingian symbols and motifs. While folkloric accounts are often embellished or allegorical, they frequently preserve kernels of truth that survive centuries of political and cultural change. When interpreted alongside archaeological and textual evidence, these stories contribute to a mosaic that points toward a sustained Merovingian presence, suggesting encounters that were significant enough to enter collective memory. Chronicles from neighboring powers also provide indirect evidence. Byzantine, Persian, and Arab sources occasionally mention Western delegations traveling through Eastern regions, bringing gifts, negotiating alliances, or seeking knowledge. While these records do not explicitly name the Merovingians, the timing, nature of the emissaries, and patterns of interaction correspond with reconstructed Merovingian routes. These independent accounts, taken together, form a network of corroborating evidence that strengthens the case for a deliberate Eastern expedition, revealing the dynasty's influence and strategic engagement with distant lands. The nature of sacred artifacts and relics further illustrates the significance of the journey. Certain objects recovered from these regions bear inscriptions in both Western European and Eastern scripts, suggesting that the emissaries were engaged in cross-cultural exchange and preservation of knowledge. These artifacts are often ritualistic, implying that their transportation and placement were not random, but part of a larger strategy to safeguard spiritual or esoteric power. The deliberate movement of such items underscores the careful planning and foresight of the Merovingians, emphasizing that the Eastern expedition was a mission of both political diplomacy and sacred preservation. Evidence of clandestine networks also emerges in the form of hidden sites, fortified locations, and enigmatic structures scattered along the hypothesized route. Archaeological surveys have revealed isolated monasteries, fortresses, and caches that seem incongruent with the local political or trade context. Some researchers speculate that these locations served as way stations, safe houses, or repositories for knowledge and relics transported by Merovingian emissaries. The alignment of certain structures with celestial events or sacred geometry suggests that their placement may have been deliberate, encoding both spiritual and practical information that guided future travelers or safeguarded esoteric wisdom. Finally, the patterns of suppression and disappearance provide indirect, yet telling evidence. The erasure of certain records, the destruction of manuscripts, and the deliberate omission of Eastern journeys from mainstream histories suggest that the expedition was significant enough to warrant concealment. This suppression may have been driven by political, religious, or strategic concerns, highlighting that the Eastern journey was not only a matter of historical record, but of knowledge and power carefully controlled. The very gaps in the historical record, therefore, become evidence in themselves, hinting at a story that was deliberately obscured. Taken together, these diverse strands of evidence, textual, cartographic, archaeological, linguistic, and folkloric, create a compelling picture of the Merovingians' Eastern expedition. While no single piece provides a complete narrative, the convergence of multiple sources across disciplines strengthens the case for a deliberate, strategic, and multifaceted journey. It suggests a dynasty that operated simultaneously in the political, spiritual, and intellectual realms, orchestrating a campaign designed to secure knowledge, forge alliances, and safeguard a legacy that extended far beyond their immediate dominion. The evidence also underscores the extraordinary complexity and foresight of the Merovingians. They were not merely travelers or conquerors. They were visionaries capable of operating in the shadows, leaving a trail of subtle but enduring influence. Each artifact, map, manuscript, and story provides a glimpse into the meticulous planning and strategic insight required to execute such an expedition. Their Eastern journey, once largely forgotten, now emerges through these fragments as a testament to the dynasty's sophistication, ambition, and enduring desire to shape the world in ways both visible and hidden. In piecing together the evidence, a narrative begins to emerge, one that combines diplomacy, exploration, sacred knowledge, and deliberate concealment. It reveals a dynasty operating across continents, navigating complex political landscapes, and engaging with distant cultures while preserving secrets intended for posterity. The Eastern expedition is thus not merely a historical curiosity. It is a multidimensional mission that exemplifies the Merovingians' vision of power, knowledge, and spiritual authority. In conclusion, the evidence of the Merovingians' Eastern journey may be fragmented and elusive, but it is undeniable in its significance. From manuscripts and maps to artifacts, oral traditions, and architectural anomalies, a picture forms of a dynasty whose reach extended far beyond what conventional history acknowledges. The expedition underscores the dynasty's foresight, strategic acumen, and commitment to preserving sacred knowledge. It serves as a reminder that history is often hidden in plain sight, and that the traces of remarkable journeys, like that of the Merovingians, require patience, insight, and imagination to uncover. Throughout history, the Merovingians have been shrouded not only in mystery, but in a web of prophecy and ancient texts, some of which remain hidden in monasteries, private collections, and secret libraries. These texts, written in obscure dialects and often coded in allegory, hint at journeys and destinies that transcend the known maps of medieval Europe. While mainstream historians often dismiss them as mere legend or political propaganda, closer examination reveals a layer of meaning that suggests a deliberate attempt to encode knowledge about forgotten lands and secret missions, including journeys toward the east that remain largely invisible to conventional records. One of the recurring themes in these manuscripts is the idea of a hidden path or a trail of the chosen, phrases that appear across different documents and in various forms. Some scholars argue these references are symbolic, representing spiritual journeys or moral guidance for the dynasty. Yet, when read in conjunction with maps and geographical annotations found in other contemporaneous works, The evidence points toward actual physical journeys, expeditions undertaken with purpose, guided by knowledge that the general populace, and perhaps even the royal courts of other nations, were never meant to understand. Certain prophecies attributed to early Merovingian chroniclers speak of distant lands rich in resources, sanctuaries of wisdom, and cities that exist beyond the sunrise, a term that some interpret as pointing eastward toward regions that at the time were considered remote or inaccessible. These writings are often cryptic, blending religious imagery with political allegory. References to sacred relics, celestial alignments, and the blood of kings suggest that these were not merely travelogues, but documents intended to preserve esoteric knowledge across generations. The Merovingians, after all, were deeply invested in the mystique of their lineage, and these texts may have functioned as both instruction and warning, guiding select members of the dynasty while concealing their intentions from outsiders. One particularly intriguing text, preserved in Fragments, speaks of a kingdom hidden by mists and rivers, guarded by those who remember the old ways. It describes a land where knowledge and relics are kept safe from those who would exploit them. While no concrete location is named, the descriptions of climate, geography, and celestial phenomena suggest territories far from Western Europe, possibly in regions corresponding to Eastern Europe, the steppes, or even Central Asia. Some researchers have theorized that these texts were written in code, using metaphors recognizable only to the initiated, a method not uncommon among secretive dynasties seeking to protect knowledge from political rivals or invading powers. In addition to written texts, oral traditions play a critical role in understanding these prophecies. Folklore from regions historically along the eastern route contains echoes of the Merovingian presence. Stories of pale kings, sacred treasures, and mysterious emissaries arriving from the west bear uncanny resemblance to motifs found in the written prophecies. These oral accounts, often dismissed by historians as superstition, may instead preserve genuine historical memory, offering corroborative details that strengthen the case for an Eastern journey by the Merovingians. Moreover, the influence of Christian mysticism and Gnostic thought is evident throughout these texts. Symbols, numerology, and allegorical references point to a worldview where earthly geography and spiritual geography were intertwined. Journeys eastward may have represented not just physical travel, but the pursuit of hidden wisdom, a quest to retrieve or safeguard knowledge considered sacred, esoteric, or even dangerous in the wrong hands. In this context, the Merovingian Eastern journey could be seen as a dual mission, both territorial and spiritual, navigating unknown lands while adhering to codes encoded in prophetic writings. Interestingly, several of these ancient texts appear to have inspired later generations of scholars, explorers, and secret societies. Some researchers suggest that the Rosicrucians, alchemists, and even Templar remnants may have drawn upon these Merovingian prophecies in their own quest for knowledge and hidden treasures. This creates a thread connecting the Merovingians' eastward endeavors with a much broader historical tapestry of esoteric exploration, suggesting that the dynasty's hidden missions resonated far beyond their immediate era. Ultimately, the prophecies and texts surrounding the Merovingians invite a deeper contemplation of history. They remind us that much of what is recorded in official chronicles is merely the surface of a far richer, more complex story. Hidden within the allegories, metaphors, and coded instructions are hints of real journeys, strategic movements, and deliberate concealment of knowledge. For the attentive observer, these writings are not just curiosities but guides, tantalizing fragments that may yet reveal the locations, purposes, and outcomes of a forgotten Eastern expedition, a journey whose full details remain obscured by time, secrecy, and the deliberate suppression of knowledge. As we trace these prophecies alongside maps, artifacts, and legends, a pattern emerges. The Merovingians were not merely rulers of a fading dynasty in Western Europe, but custodians of a network of knowledge and power that extended far beyond their traditional domains. Each cryptic text, each symbolic prophecy, serves as a thread in a vast tapestry, weaving together history, myth, and secret knowledge. The eastern lands, once forgotten, begin to emerge not just as distant territories, but as integral components of a story that challenges everything we think we know about the Merovingians, their ambitions, and their enduring legacy. As the Merovingians ventured eastward, the landscapes and peoples they encountered were unlike anything described in the chronicles of Western Europe. These journeys were not mere diplomatic missions or trade excursions. They were deliberate crossings into territories rich with culture, spiritual knowledge, and political complexity. The dynastic emissaries, sometimes traveling with small contingents of trusted knights, scholars, and advisors, found themselves in lands dominated by kingdoms and city-states whose histories were deeply intertwined with traditions unknown to the West. Each encounter was a collision of civilizations, a blending of knowledge, and, often, a careful negotiation of influence and secrecy. The earliest accounts suggest that the Merovingians may have moved along well-established trade routes, connecting Western Europe to the eastern steppes, and ultimately, to regions bordering the Caspian and Black Seas. Along the way, they would have come into contact with nomadic tribes, mercantile cities, and dynastic powers that had flourished for centuries. These cultures possessed sophisticated systems of governance, religious practices, and esoteric knowledge, some of which may have been deliberately recorded in ways accessible only to initiates. For the Merovingians, these interactions were opportunities to acquire knowledge, form alliances, and perhaps secure relics and artifacts that were considered sacred or powerful. One of the most intriguing aspects of these encounters was the exchange of knowledge. The Merovingians are rumored to have possessed scrolls, coded manuscripts, and artifacts imbued with symbolic meaning. When they met with Eastern scholars, priests, and rulers, there was a mutual interest in esoteric knowledge, a careful dance of revealing and concealing information. Local traditions suggest that these emissaries were sometimes regarded as bearers of divine authority, their bloodline imbued with a mystique that lent weight to their words and intentions. At the same time, the Merovingians may have absorbed spiritual practices, astronomical knowledge, and cosmological insights from the cultures they encountered, integrating these elements into their own secretive traditions. Cities along the Eastern journey, often hubs of commerce and culture, were described in fragmented texts as centers of remarkable architectural and intellectual achievement. Markets thrived with exotic goods, spices, metals, textiles, and manuscripts written in scripts unfamiliar to Western eyes. Here, the Merovingians could have established discrete networks for information gathering, cultural exchange, and the acquisition of knowledge deemed too dangerous or valuable to be left in local hands. Tales preserved in oral histories speak of emissaries observing rituals, studying sacred geometry, and even participating in ceremonies that fused the spiritual and political, acts that left a lasting impression on both the hosts and the travelers. Religious and spiritual encounters were particularly significant. The regions traversed were home to a variety of belief systems: Zoroastrian, Gnostic, and early Islamic, among others, each with its own understanding of sacred power, cosmology, and ritual practice. The Merovingians' interest in such knowledge likely extended beyond mere curiosity. Prophetic texts and esoteric manuscripts suggest that they were seeking wisdom that could reinforce the mystical legitimacy of their own bloodline, potentially uncovering secrets that connected Eastern metaphysics with their European dominion. The act of negotiating with these cultures required subtle diplomacy, ritual observance, and perhaps coded communication to ensure that sacred knowledge was both acquired and preserved without provoking political or spiritual conflict. The visual and symbolic language of these encounters is also worth noting. Artifacts found in Eastern settlements sometimes bear symbols remarkably similar to those used by the Merovingians in Western Europe. Whether through coincidence, influence, or deliberate exchange, these parallels suggest a continuity of mystical ideas and a subtle cross-cultural dialogue. Some historians propose that these symbols may have served as markers, a kind of secret map of alliances, sacred locations, or protected knowledge, visible only to those initiated into the corresponding traditions. In this way, the Eastern journey was not only a passage through geography, but a traversal of a hidden spiritual and intellectual landscape. Trade, too, played a role in these encounters. Beyond the exchange of goods, the Merovingians may have been seeking rare materials with spiritual or ceremonial significance. Metals, gemstones, and pigments used in ritual practices or artifacts. The journey eastward allowed them access to these resources while simultaneously embedding themselves in local networks of influence. Historical records hint at the strategic marriages, partnerships, and pacts forged during this time, suggesting that the Merovingians' Eastern mission was as much about securing long-term influence as it was about immediate exploration or discovery. Equally important were the challenges and conflicts that arose. Not all encounters were peaceful. Nomadic tribes and established kingdoms were cautious of foreign emissaries, particularly those bearing esoteric symbols or claiming divine lineage. The Merovingians had to navigate threats, negotiate safe passage, and, in some instances, use their reputation and mystique to deter aggression. These confrontations, whether subtle or overt, added a layer of tension to their journeys, emphasizing that this was not simply a diplomatic voyage, but a careful, calculated expedition through politically and culturally complex territories. Ultimately, these encounters with other cultures were transformative. They were more than mere stops along a journey. They were opportunities for the Merovingians to consolidate knowledge, expand their influence, and ensure that their secretive traditions would survive beyond the borders of Western Europe. The records they left, fragmented, allegorical, and often intentionally obscured, hint at a dynasty engaging with the world not as conquerors alone, but as seekers, negotiators, and custodians of hidden wisdom. Each meeting, each observation, and each acquisition was a thread woven into the tapestry of a forgotten Eastern journey, a narrative that challenges the conventional understanding of Merovingian history and underscores the dynasty's far-reaching ambitions and mysterious legacy. Through this lens, the Merovingians' encounters with other cultures were not incidental. They were deliberate steps in a journey designed to preserve and expand knowledge, to engage with civilizations possessing complementary wisdom, and to chart a course that would leave an enduring, albeit hidden, impact on history. These interactions, preserved in fragments of text, oral legend, and symbolic artifacts, form a crucial part of understanding the Eastern journey, a journey that continues to fascinate, challenge, and inspire curiosity to this day. Modern scholarship and research into the Merovingians' Eastern journeys often straddle the line between established history and speculative inquiry. For centuries, mainstream historians have largely focused on the dynasty's role within Western Europe, tracing kings, battles, and political alliances, while largely ignoring tantalizing hints that the Merovingians may have ventured far beyond their traditional territories. Yet, over the past century, historians, archaeologists, and independent researchers have begun to unearth fragments of evidence suggesting that these journeys were not merely legend, but grounded in concrete historical realities. These discoveries, though often controversial, offer glimpses into a world that mainstream academia has largely overlooked or dismissed. One of the most significant areas of modern research involves the careful examination of maps, manuscripts, and chronicles that survived both the passage of time and deliberate destruction. Scholars have begun to cross-reference Western European sources with Eastern and Central Asian records, seeking overlaps in trade routes, political encounters, and accounts of foreign emissaries. In many cases, subtle similarities emerge. Descriptions of pale-skinned or foreign emissaries arriving in distant cities, records of gifts and relics exchanged, and mentions of cryptic messages left behind by travelers whose origins are not fully documented. These fragments, when pieced together, hint at a Merovingian presence far beyond the boundaries of the Frankish kingdom. Archaeology has also contributed new perspectives, albeit indirectly. Excavations in Eastern Europe and parts of Central Asia have uncovered artifacts bearing symbols or motifs reminiscent of Merovingian design. From intricately decorated jewelry and ceremonial objects to coins and seals, these items suggest that the dynasty may have had influence, direct or indirect, in regions previously thought to be untouched by Western European dynasties. Some researchers propose that these artifacts were either transported during official emissary missions or left behind by traveling nobles who engaged in clandestine diplomatic or spiritual exchanges. While definitive proof linking these objects to the Merovingians remains elusive, the patterns are too striking to dismiss entirely. Modern technological tools have further opened doors to exploration. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and geophysical surveys have revealed potential settlement sites and forgotten fortifications along likely eastern routes. Some locations show anomalies consistent with urban planning or construction styles that, while not definitively Merovingian, resemble architectural features known from Western European sources of the same period. Scholars and independent researchers theorize that these may have been temporary outposts, way stations, or even hidden enclaves designed to support long-range journeys, preserve knowledge, or facilitate contact with local rulers and cultures. Historical linguistics offers another avenue of insight. Certain words, phrases, or symbolic terms appearing in Eastern texts bear striking resemblance to Merovingian glosses or coded language. These linguistic echoes suggest some form of cultural transmission, whether through trade, marriage alliances, or direct contact, that left subtle imprints on local records. Researchers analyzing these texts often find layers of meaning, some overt and others hidden, that could indicate knowledge sharing, spiritual instruction, or the passing of esoteric wisdom tied to the Merovingian bloodline. One of the most compelling modern lines of investigation concerns the surviving chronicles of travelers and scholars from the medieval period. Accounts of envoys arriving from the West, mysterious emissaries bearing gifts, or foreign rulers seeking audiences with distant kings often contain tantalizingly specific details that align with Merovingian interests. In some cases, the records mention objects of sacred or mystical significance, texts, or symbols whose origin remains debated. When examined collectively, these sources suggest that the Merovingians' eastern journey was deliberate, systematic, and carefully orchestrated to remain largely invisible to broader historical awareness. Independent researchers and amateur historians have also contributed significantly to uncovering this hidden narrative. Many have spent decades cross-referencing historical records, local legends, and archaeological findings, producing detailed maps, timelines, and hypotheses about the routes and purposes of these journeys. While such work is often dismissed by traditional academia due to its speculative nature, the depth and rigor of some investigations provide compelling support for the possibility that the Merovingians extended their reach far beyond conventional historical accounts. These modern explorations reinforce the notion that history is not static. It is layered, complex, and frequently subject to suppression, oversight, or selective preservation. One striking feature of contemporary research is the role of digital archives and global collaboration. Previously inaccessible manuscripts, preserved in monasteries or private collections, are now being digitized and analyzed using advanced tools, including AI-assisted pattern recognition and text analysis. Scholars are able to detect recurring motifs, coded instructions, and subtle references that may have been invisible to earlier generations of historians. In several cases, these efforts have revealed connections between Western European Merovingian texts and documents from Eastern regions, strengthening the case for long-distance interaction and suggesting that some of the dynasty's journeys were both purposeful and meticulously recorded, albeit in secret. Yet, despite these advances, skepticism remains. Critics argue that the evidence is circumstantial, fragmentary, and prone to misinterpretation. Many artifacts could be coincidental, and maps may contain symbolic or allegorical rather than literal geographical references. However, proponents of alternative history argue that this skepticism itself reflects the limitations of conventional historiography, a discipline often unwilling to engage fully with evidence that challenges established narratives. For those willing to explore these hidden threads, the convergence of textual, archaeological, and technological evidence paint a picture of a dynasty with ambitions and networks far greater than previously recognized. Ultimately, modern research into the Merovingians' eastern journey underscores the delicate balance between myth and history, secrecy and revelation. Each discovery, whether a fragmentary manuscript, a mysterious artifact, or an anomalous archaeological site, serves as a piece of a puzzle deliberately obscured for centuries. Together, they hint at a network of knowledge, influence, and movement that challenges our conventional understanding of medieval Europe and illuminates a path toward forgotten lands and hidden histories. In tracing these threads, modern scholars and enthusiasts are not merely reconstructing a journey. They are uncovering a complex tapestry of culture, power, and esoteric wisdom, one that bridges East and West, past and present, myth and reality. These contemporary investigations remind us that history is never complete. The Merovingians' journey eastward may remain partially hidden, but every manuscript decoded, every artifact analyzed, and every narrative pieced together brings us closer to understanding the full scope of a dynasty that sought not only to rule, but to preserve and transmit knowledge across continents, generations, and cultures. The echoes of their journey continue to resonate, inviting us to question what we know, explore what has been forgotten, and imagine the vast expanse of history still waiting to be revealed. Even as modern research uncovers tantalizing fragments of the Merovingians' eastern journey, there's a pervasive sense that much of what they accomplished, and perhaps even discovered, has been deliberately concealed from the historical record. Conspiracies and cover-ups, whether orchestrated by political authorities, religious institutions, or secretive elite factions, seem to form an invisible barrier between mainstream history and the deeper truths embedded in the Merovingians' legacy. These efforts to suppress knowledge are hinted at in mysterious gaps in chronicles, destroyed or altered manuscripts, and the careful omission of Eastern journeys in conventional histories. The question lingers, why would so much effort be made to erase or obscure these events? Some historians and alternative researchers suggest that the suppression was motivated by a desire to control knowledge of the Merovingians' sacred bloodline, esoteric wisdom, and the artifacts they may have transported. The dynasty's influence extended beyond politics into spiritual and mystical realms, granting them access to traditions that threatened the authority of established powers. Religious institutions, particularly those invested in maintaining orthodoxy, would have found the dissemination of such knowledge dangerous, potentially undermining their control over doctrine, relics, and spiritual legitimacy. In this light, the concealment of the Merovingians' eastern journey may have been less about geography and more about safeguarding hidden wisdom from falling into the wrong hands. The evidence of deliberate erasure is scattered but compelling. Certain chronicles, once thought comprehensive, suddenly end or skip decades during critical periods, leaving historians to puzzle over missing narratives. Manuscripts are known to have been burned, censored, or altered, sometimes in monasteries far removed from the Merovingians' immediate sphere of influence. Maps, too, often contain blank regions or deliberately vague territories, suggesting a conscious effort to obscure specific locations. Some researchers theorize that the Merovingians themselves may have participated in this concealment, encoding knowledge in allegory, symbolism, and secret networks that only select initiates could interpret. Conspiracies extend beyond medieval times into more modern history. Reports and documents hint at hidden caches of Merovingian artifacts, possibly moved during periods of upheaval in Europe, such as the French Revolution or the World Wars, when the chaos of conflict provided opportunities to safeguard or seize ancient treasures. Certain collections of artifacts, manuscripts, and relics remain in private hands or locked away in institutional vaults, accessible only to a few. Scholars attempting to track these items often encounter bureaucratic resistance or disappear into dead ends, further reinforcing the sense of deliberate suppression. Secret societies, both historical and modern, are frequently implicated in preserving or controlling Merovingian knowledge. Groups such as the Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and other esoteric orders have long claimed connections, either direct or symbolic, to the dynasty. Whether these groups were attempting to protect sacred knowledge, manipulate political power, or maintain an aura of mystery, their influence contributes to the veil of secrecy surrounding the Eastern journey. In some cases, encoded messages, cryptic symbols, and ritual practices may serve as markers for locations, alliances, or hidden knowledge, readable only by those with the requisite training or insight. Political motivations also play a role in the suppression of information. The Merovingians' connections to distant lands and influential cultures may have conflicted with the ambitions of rising powers in Europe and beyond. Knowledge of these connections, if publicized, could challenge prevailing narratives of lineage, authority, and territorial legitimacy. By controlling the historical record, rulers and institutions could ensure that the Merovingians' broader influence remained invisible, preserving the authority of those in power and limiting access to information that might inspire alternative interpretations of European history. Even in modern times, evidence of obfuscation persists. Academic gatekeeping, selective publication of findings, and restricted access to certain archives create additional hurdles for those attempting to uncover the full story. Occasionally, new evidence emerges, only to be challenged or dismissed by established authorities. Researchers note that the further east one looks, the more fragmented and difficult the trail becomes, as if deliberate measures were taken to erase or scatter the documentation. Satellite imagery, linguistic studies, and archaeological findings often provide only partial answers, leaving tantalizing gaps that spark both intrigue and frustration. In addition, the interplay of myth and conspiracy enhances the sense of hidden agendas. Legends of secret chambers, concealed manuscripts, and lost relics combine with historical fact to create a layered narrative where truth and deception intertwine. The Merovingians' reputation for mystique, combined with the tangible evidence of journeys, alliances, and artifacts, suggests that deliberate secrecy was an integral part of their strategy. It was not enough to explore, discover, or acquire knowledge. That knowledge had to be protected, hidden, and transmitted only to those deemed worthy, reinforcing the sense that conspiracies were not incidental but central to the dynasty's enduring influence. The consequences of these cover-ups are profound. By obscuring the Merovingians' eastern journeys, history has been stripped of a significant chapter in the story of human exploration, cultural exchange, and the preservation of knowledge. The suppression has also created fertile ground for speculation, allowing alternative histories, myths, and conspiracies to flourish. For modern researchers and enthusiasts, this duality between what is hidden and what can be pieced together creates both the challenge and allure of uncovering the Merovingians' forgotten lands. Ultimately, conspiracies and cover-ups surrounding the Merovingians are more than just historical curiosities. They're a testament to the dynasty's strategic brilliance and the enduring power of knowledge. Every burned manuscript, altered map, or secreted artifact is a reminder that history is often written not only by those who record it, but also by those who deliberately seek to conceal it. The Eastern Journey, once obscured by layers of secrecy, gradually emerges as a narrative of ambition, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge, a journey that challenges our understanding of both the Merovingians and the broader currents of European and global history. The evidence of suppression also underscores a recurring theme, the intertwining of power and secrecy. To fully appreciate the Merovingians' Eastern Journey, one must not only consider the geographical and cultural aspects, but also the deliberate obfuscation, the hidden agendas, and the intricate networks designed to protect and preserve their secrets. In piecing together these threads, modern researchers are not merely reconstructing a lost journey. They're illuminating the deliberate design of secrecy itself, revealing a dynasty that understood the value of both knowledge and its concealment, and whose legacy continues to challenge and captivate the imagination. After centuries of fragmented accounts, obscure texts, and tantalizing hints, the Eastern Journey of the Merovingians begins to take shape when we piece together the threads of history, legend, and modern research. What emerges is not merely a sequence of travels across distant lands, but a deliberate, multidimensional expedition that intertwines politics, spirituality, and the pursuit of hidden knowledge. By connecting the fragments preserved in manuscripts, artifacts, maps, and oral traditions, a pattern emerges, a tapestry of purpose, strategy, and secrecy that reveals the Merovingians not just as rulers of Western Europe, but as custodians of a wider network of influence stretching into the East. The journey appears to have begun with carefully selected emissaries, members of the royal household, trusted knights, and scholars who possess the knowledge and skills necessary to navigate both foreign courts and esoteric traditions. Unlike ordinary diplomats, these travelers carried coded manuscripts, symbolic relics, and artifacts imbued with meaning that extended beyond the material. Their mission was dual: to establish contact with distant rulers and cultures, and to recover or safeguard knowledge and objects of spiritual, mystical, or practical significance. Every step of the journey was meticulously planned, guided by cryptic maps and prophecies that had been carefully preserved within the Merovingian bloodline. The route itself, as reconstructed from overlapping sources, suggests a deliberate path through Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, along rivers and trade routes that allowed access to remote regions without attracting undue attention. Key waypoints appear to correspond with cities of strategic or spiritual importance, centers of scholarship, commerce, or religious influence. Here, the Merovingians would have engaged in exchanges both overt and subtle, leaving behind tokens, coded messages, or symbolic markers intended to guide future generations or select allies. Archaeological anomalies, local legends, and surviving artifacts provide glimpses of these encounters, hinting at the dynasty's far-reaching vision and meticulous planning. Along the way, the Merovingians encountered cultures whose knowledge and traditions were deeply complementary to their own esoteric practices. From Gnostic sects and early Eastern Christian communities to nomadic tribes with sophisticated oral traditions, each interaction offered the potential to acquire insights into cosmology, sacred geometry, medicinal practices, and astronomical observations. The Merovingians appear to have sought these encounters deliberately, carefully balancing diplomacy with discretion, ensuring that the knowledge they obtained was preserved without provoking hostility or revealing the full extent of their mission. The integration of these insights into their own traditions likely strengthened the mystical authority of the dynasty, reinforcing the notion of a sacred bloodline tasked with guarding knowledge that spanned continents. Fragments of maps preserved in obscure manuscripts further suggest that the journey extended beyond Eastern Europe, possibly reaching the steppes of Central Asia and territories bordering the Caspian and Black Seas. Here, trade networks, fortified cities, and secluded monasteries may have served as repositories of knowledge and waypoints for travelers. The Merovingians' presence, though subtle, may have influenced local politics and spiritual practices, leaving traces detectable only through careful cross-cultural study. References in contemporary chronicles hint at emissaries bringing gifts, establishing pacts, and even participating in ceremonial rituals, suggesting that the Eastern journey was both a practical expedition and a sacred quest. Relics, artifacts, and symbolic objects appear to have played a crucial role throughout the journey. Items of ceremonial significance, inscriptions encoded with numerical or astronomical meaning, and objects associated with sacred traditions were likely transported along the route. In some cases, these objects may have been left in safe locations, forming caches or markers to guide future Merovingian emissaries or allies. The recurrence of specific symbols across Western and Eastern contexts implies a continuity of knowledge that transcends geography, creating a hidden network of cultural and spiritual transmission that spans the regions traversed by the dynasty. Prophecies and coded texts also emerge as vital tools in reconstructing the journey. Cryptic references to distant lands, celestial events, and sacred relics suggest that the Merovingians were guided not only by maps, but by esoteric instruction embedded within their own cultural and spiritual traditions. These prophecies, interpreted in tandem with geographic and archaeological evidence, reveal a journey that was as much about the acquisition and preservation of knowledge as it was about physical travel. They suggest a careful orchestration, a narrative that unfolded across both space and time, designed to protect and perpetuate wisdom that might otherwise be lost to history. The journey was not without peril. Remote regions presented logistical challenges, from harsh climates and treacherous terrain to political instability and the potential for conflict with local powers. The Merovingians' emissaries would have needed to exercise diplomacy, negotiation, and occasionally subterfuge to navigate these dangers successfully. Some chronicles and oral traditions hint at near misses, evasive maneuvers, and clandestine meetings that allowed the travelers to avoid detection while achieving their objectives. These accounts, when pieced together, portray a campaign of extraordinary planning, foresight, and adaptability, a journey that required both worldly skill and spiritual insight. Modern analysis provides additional layers of understanding. Satellite imagery, geophysical surveys, and cross-referencing of historical accounts have revealed potential sites that correspond with descriptions in manuscripts, suggesting the existence of fortifications, settlements, or ceremonial spaces linked to the Merovingians. Linguistic and symbolic analysis indicates the deliberate use of coded language to conceal critical information from outsiders while preserving it for the initiated. Even local folklore, when examined carefully, provides corroborative evidence. Tales of pale kings, sacred relics, or mysterious emissaries that align with the reconstructed route and timeline of the Eastern journey. By integrating these diverse sources, textual, archaeological, linguistic, and folkloric, a coherent narrative begins to emerge. The Eastern journey of the Merovingians was not random, but highly intentional. It combined strategic political engagement, spiritual exploration, and the deliberate safeguarding of knowledge across vast distances. The dynasty's emissaries moved with purpose, leaving a trail of encoded messages, symbolic artifacts, and subtle influences that persist in the historical record, if one knows where to look. The journey reveals the Merovingians as visionaries, conscious of their role as custodians of wisdom, capable of operating both in the visible political sphere and the hidden spiritual landscape. Ultimately, piecing together the Eastern journey transforms our understanding of the Merovingians. No longer can they be seen solely as rulers of early medieval Western Europe. They emerge as actors on a much broader stage, navigating the complex cultural, spiritual, and political landscapes of the East. Their journey was a deliberate expedition into both physical and metaphysical territories, a quest to acquire, preserve, and transmit knowledge that transcended conventional boundaries. Through this lens, the dynasty's forgotten lands are not just geographical locales, but conceptual spaces, regions of influence, repositories of wisdom, and touchstones of a legacy that bridges continents and centuries. The Eastern Journey also illuminates the broader implications of hidden history. By reconstructing the path, the alliances formed, and the knowledge exchanged, we gain insight into the ways dynasties like the Merovingians engaged with the wider world, often in ways that were deliberately obscured from mainstream accounts. It challenges the boundaries of accepted historiography and invites a reconsideration of the networks of power, knowledge, and influence that shaped medieval and early modern Eurasia. The Eastern Journey, once forgotten, now stands as a testament to the ambition, foresight, and enduring mystique of a dynasty whose legacy continues to captivate the imagination. In tracing this journey, we not only uncover a path through distant lands, but also through the layers of secrecy, symbolism, and strategy that define the Merovingians' approach to power and knowledge. Each step, each encounter, and each relic recovered forms part of a story deliberately concealed, yet slowly revealed through the careful piecing together of evidence. This narrative, meticulously reconstructed, offers a rare glimpse into a dynasty that understood both the value of exploration and the necessity of discretion, leaving behind a trail of intrigue, wisdom, an enduring mystery that continues to challenge historians and captivate the curious. The revelations of the Merovingians' Eastern Journey carry profound implications for our understanding of history, civilization, and the transmission of knowledge. If the fragments of evidence, maps, artifacts, and oral traditions pieced together are accurate, then our conventional narratives of medieval Europe and its interactions with the wider world are incomplete at best and deliberately constrained at worst. The dynasty's expeditions into the East suggest a level of sophistication, foresight, and cross-cultural engagement that challenges the notion of the early medieval period as isolated or intellectually insular. Instead, we glimpse a Europe whose rulers were acutely aware of distant powers, spiritual currents, and the importance of preserving esoteric knowledge across borders. One of the most striking implications is the reconsideration of the Merovingians not merely as kings, but as custodians of knowledge. Their expeditions were not simply about territorial expansion or political alliances. They were missions designed to acquire, safeguard, and transmit wisdom. This suggests that knowledge in the early medieval period was a strategic asset, and that certain dynasties, like the Merovingians, understood the value of intellectual and spiritual capital as profoundly as they understood the value of armies or fortifications. Such a perspective invites a re-evaluation of the ways power and knowledge were intertwined, revealing a deliberate interplay between the visible and hidden aspects of influence. The Eastern Journey also has implications for the understanding of cultural exchange. By moving into distant lands, the Merovingians engaged with civilizations that were advanced in trade, science, religion, and mysticism. These interactions were likely subtle but consequential, leaving traces in local customs, symbolism, and artifacts. The possibility that knowledge was transferred, adapted, or codified in secret networks challenges the conventional understanding of European intellectual history, suggesting that important developments in philosophy, alchemy, astronomy, or esoteric practice may have roots in cross-cultural encounters deliberately concealed from the mainstream historical record. Religious and spiritual implications are equally significant. The Merovingians' reputed sacred bloodline and their esoteric pursuits suggest a deliberate attempt to harmonize or integrate Western and Eastern mystical traditions. Their journeys may have facilitated the movement of rituals, symbols, and sacred objects that influenced not only the dynasty itself, but also the religious landscape of the regions they touched. This raises questions about the origins of certain practices, prophecies, or ceremonial techniques that may have been preserved in secrecy, impacting spiritual traditions in ways largely unrecognized by conventional historiography. The political ramifications are noteworthy as well. If the Merovingians established networks of influence in the East, these interactions would have positioned them as actors within a larger geopolitical landscape than previously imagined. Their journeys were strategic as much as mystical, establishing lines of communication, alliances, and knowledge networks that could outlast political upheavals in their home territories. This perspective invites a reconsideration of power in the early medieval world, emphasizing the importance of intelligence, subtle diplomacy, and clandestine influence alongside traditional military or territorial achievements. Furthermore, the evidence of deliberate suppression and cover-ups underscores the fragility and selectivity of historical knowledge. Institutions, both religious and political, may have intentionally obscured the Merovingians' eastern expeditions to control narratives, safeguard secrets, or limit the dissemination of sacred knowledge. This invites broader reflection on how history is constructed, recorded, and preserved. What we accept as historical fact may be only a partial representation of reality, shaped by those with the authority and motivation to control which stories endure. Understanding the Merovingians' eastern journey challenges us to question what else may be hidden, intentionally or inadvertently, in the shadows of recorded history. The implications extend to the modern study of history itself. The synthesis of textual analysis, archaeology, linguistics, and oral traditions demonstrates that a multidisciplinary approach can reveal hidden patterns, bridging gaps left by conventional scholarship. The Merovingians' journey exemplifies how evidence must be approached holistically, connecting seemingly disparate pieces to reconstruct a more complete narrative. It suggests that many historical mysteries may not be unsolvable, but simply require a willingness to look beyond standard sources, to interrogate silences, and to integrate data from multiple disciplines. There are also philosophical and existential considerations. The Eastern journey, shrouded in secrecy, invites reflection on the nature of knowledge, its preservation, and its ethical dissemination. The Merovingians appear to have recognized the power inherent in knowledge, understanding that some truths must be guarded, passed selectively, or hidden entirely to prevent misuse. This duality, the tension between revelation and concealment, resonates today, reminding us that history is not merely about events, but about the careful management of information, memory, and influence across generations. On a cultural level, the journey challenges assumptions about the isolation of early medieval Europe. It suggests a continent deeply engaged with distant regions, attentive to the flow of goods, ideas, and spiritual currents. The Merovingians' interactions with Eastern cultures, whether through diplomacy, trade, or esoteric exchange, imply a broader, interconnected world that was actively shaping European development in ways previously unrecognized. This reconceptualization encourages a reassessment of cross-cultural influence, revealing a tapestry of engagement that extends far beyond the familiar narratives of conquest and conflict. Finally, the Eastern journey serves as a powerful reminder of the enduring allure of mystery. By piecing together the Merovingians' path, we recognize that history is not static. It is alive, layered, and often deliberately obscured. Every artifact, manuscript, and legend offers a portal into forgotten realms, inviting exploration, reflection, and reinterpretation. The implications for civilization are profound. Understanding the flow of knowledge, the preservation of wisdom, and the networks of influence challenges us to rethink not only the past, but our relationship with the legacies left behind. In essence, the Merovingians' eastern journey transforms our perception of history. It reveals a dynasty capable of operating simultaneously in the visible and hidden worlds, navigating political, spiritual, and intellectual landscapes with sophistication and purpose. The evidence challenges conventional timelines, broadens our understanding of cultural exchange, and underscores the power of secrecy in shaping human events. By studying these journeys, we gain insight not only into a forgotten chapter of European history, but into the timeless dynamics of knowledge, power, and civilization itself. This reflection leads naturally to the consideration of unanswered questions, the mysteries that remain hidden, the paths yet unexplored, and the knowledge that may still lie buried. The journey of the Merovingians is far from fully understood, yet every revelation deepens our appreciation for the intricate web of history, highlighting how dynasties, ideas, and civilizations intersect in ways that are often invisible to the casual observer. The Eastern expedition, once shrouded in secrecy, now stands as a testament to the complexity of human ambition, intellect, and the enduring quest for understanding across cultures and continents. Even after decades of research, excavation, and careful reconstruction, the eastern journey of the Merovingians remains cloaked in mystery. For every manuscript uncovered or artifact analyzed, new questions arise, as though the dynasty itself intended for their expedition to be only partially revealed to posterity. What were the ultimate objectives of these journeys? Were they primarily political, spiritual, or a hybrid of both? And perhaps most tantalizingly, what knowledge, relics, or alliances remain hidden, waiting to be discovered? The persistence of these questions fuels both academic inquiry and the fascination of enthusiasts drawn to the interplay of history, legend, and esoteric intrigue. One of the central mysteries concerns the ultimate destinations of the Merovingian emissaries. While reconstructed routes suggest an eastward trajectory into Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and possibly Central Asia, the precise locations remain speculative. Some fragments of oral tradition hint at sacred sanctuaries or hidden enclaves, places deliberately obscured from outsiders, where knowledge and artifacts were preserved across generations. Yet the lack of definitive archaeological evidence leaves the locations of these sites uncertain. Were these destinations strategically selected for political alliances, or were they spiritual repositories meant to safeguard the esoteric knowledge of the dynasty? The answer remains elusive, teasing historians and treasure hunters alike. Another unresolved question revolves around the objects and knowledge transported during these expeditions. The Merovingians are reputed to have carried sacred relics, coded manuscripts, and artifacts of profound symbolic importance. Some of these may have been left along the route as markers, while others may have been hidden in secure locations far from the reach of conventional authorities. Are these relics still extant, preserved in secret collections, or buried in unexcavated sites? Or were some lost to time, war, or deliberate destruction? The possibility that remnants of this journey lie undiscovered fuels speculation, inviting both serious research and more imaginative interpretations. The integration of the knowledge gathered from Eastern cultures is another enduring mystery. Manuscripts and oral accounts suggest that the Merovingians absorbed spiritual, astronomical, and mystical insights during their travels. Yet how deeply these ideas influenced the dynasty's decisions, governance, and esoteric practices remains uncertain. Some scholars suggest that the dynasty's sacred bloodline was augmented or reinforced by this cross-cultural knowledge, enhancing their mystical authority. Others argue that much of this influence may have been deliberately concealed, recorded only in symbolic or allegorical terms, leaving modern historians to decipher fragments of a coded legacy. Equally enigmatic are the connections between the Merovingians and secret societies or later esoteric traditions. Scholars and researchers have long speculated that groups, such as the Rosicrucians, Freemasons, or other mystical orders, may have inherited knowledge originally safeguarded by the Merovingians. Yet the evidence is circumstantial, consisting of symbolic parallels, cryptic manuscripts, and oral traditions that hint at continuity rather than providing definitive proof. Were these societies deliberate custodians of the Merovingian legacy, or merely inspired by it? The question persists, blurring the boundaries between history, legend, and conspiracy. The role of prophecy and coded texts adds another layer of intrigue. Many Merovingian manuscripts and chroniclers' writings allude to future events, sacred relics, and hidden locations. Were these texts intended as instructions for future generations, cryptic maps of secret knowledge, or spiritual allegories? The ambiguity is deliberate, allowing only the initiated to decode their meanings. The difficulty in interpretation has left modern researchers with tantalizing hints, but no clear answers, perpetuating the sense that a significant portion of the Merovingians' purpose remains intentionally concealed. Oral traditions, too, deepen the mystery. Across Eastern Europe and Central Asia, legends of pale kings, mystical emissaries, and sacred relics echo motifs found in Merovingian texts. These stories, often dismissed as folklore, may preserve fragments of truth, encrypted in narrative form to survive centuries of cultural upheaval. Yet distinguishing fact from allegory is a persistent challenge. How much of these legends reflect genuine historical encounters, and how much has been shaped by imagination, political bias, or spiritual embellishment? Each account offers potential clues, but the fragments are incomplete, leaving the journey's full scope tantalizingly out of reach. The question of deliberate suppression continues to complicate understanding. Evidence suggests that knowledge of the Eastern journey may have been intentionally obscured by rival powers, religious authorities, or even the Merovingians themselves. Maps were altered, manuscripts destroyed or concealed, and references erased from chronicles. This intentional obfuscation creates gaps that modern researchers struggle to bridge, raising the possibility that essential pieces of the journey, entire events, locations, or discoveries, may be lost forever. Were these acts motivated by political expedience, religious preservation, or the desire to protect powerful knowledge from misuse? The motivations remain speculative, deepening the enigma. Additionally, the broader implications of the journey remain unresolved. Did the Merovingians' Eastern expedition influence subsequent European interactions with Eastern civilizations? Were ideas, technologies, or spiritual practices transmitted indirectly through these contacts, shaping medieval and early modern Europe in subtle ways? Modern research hints at these possibilities, but rarely provides concrete evidence. The extent to which the journey affected history beyond the dynasty itself remains an open question, inviting both imaginative reconstruction and rigorous scholarly inquiry. Perhaps the most enduring mystery is the human element, the experiences of those who undertook the journey. We can trace routes, artifacts, and textual fragments, but the personal insights, challenges, and revelations of the emissaries themselves are largely lost. How did they perceive the lands and cultures they encountered? What spiritual, political, or intellectual transformations did they undergo? These questions remain unanswerable, yet they are central to understanding the journey's true significance. Each emissary was not merely a traveler, but a participant in a carefully orchestrated expedition, navigating secrecy, diplomacy, and the unknown, a human story largely erased by time. Despite these unanswered questions, the process of inquiry itself illuminates the enduring fascination of the Merovingians' Eastern journey. Each mystery invites exploration, demanding the integration of history, archaeology, linguistics, and folklore. It challenges us to reconsider accepted narratives, embrace ambiguity, and recognize that the past is rarely fully knowable. The gaps and uncertainties are not failures of scholarship, but reflections of a dynasty's deliberate engagement with secrecy, knowledge, and strategic concealment. Ultimately, the continuing mysteries of the Merovingians' eastern journey serve as a reminder of the vastness of human history and the layers that remain hidden beneath conventional accounts. Each unanswered question is an invitation to probe deeper, to question assumptions, and to recognize that history is a living, evolving dialogue between what is known and what is deliberately concealed. The journey, once forgotten, continues to unfold in fragments, offering both intrigue and inspiration to those willing to seek the elusive truth hidden in the shadowed corners of Europe's past. The unresolved nature of these mysteries ensures that the Merovingians' eastern expedition will continue to captivate scholars, enthusiasts, and storytellers alike. Its allure lies not only in the revelations it offers, but in the tantalizing suggestion that entire realms of knowledge, influence, and culture remain hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. In embracing the unknown, we honor the dynasty's legacy, a legacy deliberately shrouded in secrecy, rich with possibility, and forever poised between history and legend. The legacy of the Merovingians stretches far beyond the borders of Western Europe, touching culture, spirituality, politics, and mystery. Though their reign ended centuries ago, the dynasty's influence, encoded in symbols, relics, and hidden knowledge, continues to resonate. The Eastern journey exemplifies this legacy. Emissaries were sent not merely to secure alliances or acquire resources, but to preserve and transmit wisdom that reinforced the sanctity and authority of the royal bloodline. Central to this legacy is the notion of sacred bloodline and the careful preservation of knowledge. Manuscripts, artifacts, and coded relics were selectively safeguarded, blending practical governance with spiritual insight. The dynasty understood that power was as much about wisdom as it was about armies or territory. By integrating knowledge from Eastern civilizations, the Merovingians created a cross-cultural corpus of esoteric and practical understanding that transcended geography and time. Secrecy amplifies the mystique of their influence. Routes, artifacts, and manuscripts were deliberately obscured, ensuring that only the worthy could access their deeper meanings. Their careful concealment reflects strategic foresight, enabling the dynasty's intellectual and spiritual legacy to survive centuries of upheaval. The Eastern expedition, therefore, was as much a metaphysical quest as a physical journey, leaving a trail of symbols, relics, and subtle influence for future generations to uncover. Ultimately, the Merovingians' legacy is both visible and invisible, inscribed in artifacts and texts, yet living in the questions, mysteries, and enduring fascination they inspire. Their story reminds us that history is layered, knowledge is powerful, and the past often conceals as much as it reveals. The dynasty's vision, ambition, and deliberate secrecy create a heritage that continues to captivate, challenge, and inspire those willing to explore the shadows of forgotten history.